Good morning. We're going to be starting off in Luke chapter 5 today. And this is a passage that we know well. And a lot of these stories, stories of Jesus that we see, they're really amazing in that every little thing he says and does is useful. It has meaning. You know, it puts me in mind of when people hunt an animal and they use every part of it. They don't let anything go to waste. And everything Jesus says in Scripture, everything he does, there are so many layers of meaning to it. There's so much purpose to it. There are so many people that it's for. And so many amazing things happen. And sometimes when we read these stories, especially these narratives of specific events that happened, it's easy to look at them in the sense of, well, this happened and that's it. That's awesome to see and that's good to know, but there's a lot more meaning to it in it. And today we're going to see how these events, how they impacted Jesus and his ministry, how they impacted the others around him, the people, and even us today. I want to start in verse 1, Luke chapter 5. So it was, as the multitude pressed about him to hear the word of God, that he stood by the lake of Gennesaret, or as we more commonly hear it, the Sea of Galilee, and saw two boats standing by the lake, but the fishermen had gone from them and were washing their nets. Then he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little bit from the land. And he sat down and taught the multitudes from the boat. And when he had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, "Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." But Simon answered and said to him, "Master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net." And when they had done this, they caught a great number of fish, and their net was breaking. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and they filled both the boats so that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid, for from now on you will catch men." So when they had brought their boats to land, they forsook all and followed him. And it's a passage that we often read and think of and hear of as making people fishers of men. The people saw a miracle that day. You know, there were a lot of times when Jesus was being overwhelmed by crowds. Not that it wasn't something he was handled in the sense of being overwhelmed, but in the sense that it was just a difficult situation or a massive situation or crowd to handle. And sometimes when there's a huge crowd right in front of you, it's hard to just speak to them and everyone in the back be able to hear you and things like that. So they might go up to a high place, go up on a hilltop or a mountain, or the expression, shout it from the rooftops, because it's going to get out there more and more people are going to hear it. And here, there's such a crowd that he has to go out on the water for them to be able to hear him. He has to get out and let that voice just echo over the lake and just spread out to the people. And being back like that, it's a little bit of a crowd control as well. But he comes along and he needs to speak to the people. He needs to get his teaching out, and he comes up, and these fishermen are done for the night. They've been working that third shift. They've been out all night working hard. I mean, anybody that's worked third shift knows about how much energy you have in the morning. And I could imagine how exhausting that might be on something like a fishing boat. And they're not even done. They're washing their nets. You think these fishing nets are light? I imagine after an all-nighter of probably 12 hours overnight fishing and working hard, your arms are probably jello, and now you're out here trying to wash these big, heavy fishing nets. These aren't just like a little something you'd scoop a fish out of the water with. These are massive nets, and they have to clean them, and they're probably just ready to crash and go to bed in disappointment because what does he say? You know, we toiled all night and caught nothing. And it took something that they saw in Jesus to be at that point in their night, in their morning of exhaustion, for this person to walk up and say, "Hey, let's take this boat back out." Like, are you serious? I'm going home. Have you ever been at the time clock and they come out and it's time to go, and they come out and say, "Hang on, you got to stay 4 more hours"? I've done that game before. It's really fun with a babysitter too, when you got to make new arrangements. You're ready to go home, and nope, your day's not over. You still got another half shift to do. And a lot of people probably would have said, "Sorry, buddy, we're exhausted. We're going home. We're calling it a night. You know, you find somebody else's boat, borrow my boat, whatever, I'll rent it out to you." But they didn't do that. They took him out. It says he sat down and he taught the multitudes from the boat. And when he had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, "Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." But he answered and said, "Master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net." You know, there are a lot of times that we try and fail at things in life. Or we've seen other people do things that were failed efforts. And we look at those things and we think, what's the point? Why bother ever trying that again? You know, if you go fishing in the same spot all the time and you never catch anything, why wouldn't you find a new spot to fish? You're not going to likely try the same thing and expect something different to happen. I mean, oftentimes people do, but sometimes it makes us want to give up. Sometimes maybe it's a person that you've been trying to help or to reach. Maybe it's somebody who is struggling through something that you've tried to get them out of an ugly situation, or try to uplift them in their life a little bit, or try to lead them to Jesus, or whatever it might be. And it's almost like they want so badly to be their own worst enemy that it feels like, why bother sometimes? They're never going to listen to me. That's just one of a million examples of things that we can try in life that just seem like they're never going to work because they didn't work the first time, or they didn't work several times. But things change when it's God's timing. Things change when it's at God's direction. And this wasn't just do exactly what you did and it'll work this time. You know, they're in the shallow, and he calls them to go out to the deep. And what they would do, they would fish in the shallow areas at night, because that's where all the fish would be. And then during the day, they would go out to the deeper areas and go down below where they would be less likely to be caught. So what he's asking them to do, not only does it sound counterintuitive because they haven't caught anything all night, but it sounds even more unlikely to be successful because the fish are going to be where they shouldn't be able to get to them at that time of day. But they saw something in Jesus that made them listen to him. Peter saw something in Jesus that made him call him Master. And he said, "You know what? We toiled all night, caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net." And how many times do we say, "All right, God, there's no way this should work, but I'm going to trust you. There's no way what you're calling me to makes sense in my head. On paper, this should never work, but I'm going to trust you." And when we let down that guard and we decide that we're going to trust him, it doesn't matter what hasn't worked in the past. When God calls us to something that we've tried before, it's not because he knows we're going to fail. It's not because it's impossible. When something is done in his timing and with his calling and with his blessing and with his presence and with his instruction, it doesn't matter what's happened in the past. Sorry, I'm freezing up here. There we go. For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid, for from now on you will catch men." So when they had brought their boats to land, they forsook all and followed him. You know, when they had this great success with Jesus, what did they do? They just get this great big haul in their boat and say, "Awesome, this is for us. Let's get out of here." They shared it. They called in the other boats. They shared the bounty with others. And a lot of times when God starts working in our lives and starts doing these miraculous things like he did for them, a lot of times people like to take that and sit on it. This is awesome. He's doing so many great things in my life. I'm going to withdraw into myself and just be happy in what he's doing for me. And it's wonderful to be happy about what he's doing for you. But are we sharing that with other people? Are we sharing God's love with other people? Are we sharing the wisdom of God with other people? Are we sharing the truth of the gospel with other people? Are we giving them what he's given us? Are we leading them to what he's led us to? Jesus didn't go out there on James and John's boat. He went out there on Peter's boat. But this blessing was extended to them. Why did Peter say that in verse 8? He said, when he saw this haul of fish, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." That sounds like a really curious thing to do. I caught some fish. Get away from me, Lord, I'm sinful. That doesn't make sense until you realize what just happened here. This is obviously an act of God. This is obviously something that a normal man couldn't do. This is obviously something that shocked Peter into the realization that this man is holy. And when we're faced with the holiness of God, it helps us to recognize our own lack of holiness. You know, they say that God's law and God's word it's a mirror, because when we look at it and we can see in ourselves what's there. We can see what needs to change. We can see what's good, what God is calling good. But he was seeing himself in a mirror in the presence of Jesus. You know, if I'm a little dirty from work and I'm around a bunch of other people that have been working in that same messy environment, we're all, you know, it's not really that noticeable. We're all covered in dirt head to toe or machine oil or whatever it is we've been working on that day. It's not really that noticeable. But when I leave that situation and I run into somebody who's, you know, all cleaned up and not looking the way I am, I'm like, oh man, I'm filthy, man. I gotta go home and get a shower. I used to come home from working BG like that all the time. My knees would be busted open and bleeding and grease all over my arms and everything. And I didn't think anything of it until I get around a bunch of other people that were all cleaned up and be like, oh man, I'm filthy. That's what happened in the presence of Jesus that day. You know, we get so used to overlooking things in ourselves that we justify, that we, you know, for almost as a defense mechanism, we minimize in our own mind. But when we're faced with God's presence and who he is and how holy he is, it helps me recognize how unholy I am. He's not saying, depart from me because I don't want to be around you. He's saying, depart from me because I'm not good enough for you to be here in my presence. And that's an important lesson about Jesus, because he didn't depart from him. And how often do we think that, you know what, God, I don't deserve you. I don't deserve what you did on the cross for me. I don't deserve the sacrifice of your son. I don't deserve any of this. Depart from me. I don't deserve it. But he stays. Because it's not about us deserving it. It's not about how worthy we are. It's about how worthy he is and how much he loves us despite our being unworthy. Romans 5:8 says, while we were sinners, Christ died for us. He didn't say he died for us once we got our act together. He died for us despite the way we are. He loves us despite the way we are. Not because he loves every little thing in us, but because he loves us despite those things. And he loved Peter despite these things. The crowd learned a lot that day. It's amazing to see, and it's easy to overlook how many people witnessed a lot of these events in the Bible. And we read these stories and we think of the impact that it had on the people immediately in Jesus' circle, and they're the ones that are getting most talked about in the passages. But so many times they're surrounded by crowds. They're surrounded by onlookers. There are a bunch of other people here that we're overlooking the fact that they were there watching all this. We're thinking about the fact that there was this huge haul in these boats. And we need to remember that there's a world around us that's bearing witness to the things God's doing in our lives. You know, if I claim to be a child of God, if I claim to be a Christian, people are going to take notice, and they like to either say, wow, that's amazing, look at what God's doing in their life, or, ha, I knew it, look how they really are. Look how this is all just a front. And I'll be honest, there's a lot of times when I've failed God miserably that way. There was a period of my life where I didn't tell people I was a Christian just because I didn't want to make God look bad. I was so far from him for so many years that I thought it was kind of the same mindset. Depart from me, for I'm a sinful man. I don't deserve you. I knew he was with me. I knew he was still with me. But he did not come up in conversation because as bad as I was being toward him, I didn't want to tell the people around me I was a Christian, and they'd be like, oh, that's what that is? Why in the world would I want that? I have that now. You gotta remember the world's watching us. It's just like being a representative of a company. If I'm a salesman for a company and I'm going out in their company van doing donuts in the middle of downtown Upper, I'm gonna make that company look bad. But if I'm out there sharing that company's love with people, being good to people, if I'm out there putting God on display by living the way he calls me to, and by reaching out to people, and by sharing love with people that otherwise I wouldn't have, apart from the love that God has put within me, what a different example that's going to set. It's amazing that when they had brought their boats to land, they forsook all and followed him. At a certain point, we come to this realization that no matter what I have in life that I want to cling to, it just can't compare to Jesus. It can't compare to God. It can't compare to what I can have through him. And a lot of times God calls us to give up certain things in life. And we don't know what that's going to be. It could be something seemingly good. It could be something seemingly bad. You know, there could be very good things in our life that maybe he knows if those things are gone from our life, he's got something better on the way. And when we trust in him and just step out into that deep end, look at what happened here. Jesus didn't just send him out into the deep. He said in verse 3 that he asked him to put out a little bit from land. Get in that boat, let's just go out a little bit. And after a while, he said, all right, let's go out into the deep end. God knows when we need to be gradually worked into some things. We're always afraid, a lot of times we're afraid that, God's just going to boot me into the deep end and I'm going to be in over my head. But what we see here is sometimes he inches us out that way. And in all cases, just like this case, he goes with us. I'm not worried about my boat capsizing if Jesus is riding in it with me. I'm not worried about whatever he calls me to, no matter how much it might feel like jumping into the deep end, if I know he's going to be swimming right alongside me. And just like he proved that to them that day, that he was trustworthy and that they could rely on him, he's proven that to me in my life so many times, and I know to many of you he has too. And when we look back on those times that he's gotten us through these seemingly impossible situations, how much more confidence does that give us that he is somebody that's worthy of exactly what they did? They forsook all and followed him. He's not calling us to throw away everything in our life just to follow him. Maybe in random situations he might, I don't know. But in doing this, he's calling us to put him before all those things. God is and should be the number one thing in my life. That doesn't mean that I forsake to the point of excluding everyone else in my life and everything else in my life. In fact, if I'm putting God first, all those other relationships are going to be better than they would have been if I were putting them first. It's just going to amplify what's already there and bring it to something so much greater. We need to remember that sometimes when it feels like God's calling us to something that's a waste of time, or it's going to be throwing us into the deep end, that he's going to be right there walking us through it. He's going to be right there holding on to us. That's the thing. There are so many times that people get this idea that when God calls us to something, we're going to have to just muscle our way through it and do it for him. God's our muscle. God's our source. He's our power in all these things. He goes with us. He doesn't just say, hey, go do that. Best of luck to you. He says, hey, let's go do this. I'm going to be right there with you. But first we have to have him right here with us. First we have to have him in our life. God's not going to go with someone he's not with. And that all starts in putting our trust in Jesus and calling upon him for salvation. And having the Holy Spirit dwelling within us and working through us in our day-to-day lives. We need to remember that no matter how impossible something seems, no matter how hopeless it might seem, no matter how much it seems like I've tried this a million times, what's the point? If he's going with us, we're not going to fail. We need to trust in him.